very exciting lab. Hopefully you're not part of it. Drinking in front of all these other people. So if you've got lab tonight, hopefully you stopped eating 4 hours ago, or no, not 4 hours ago, 4 hours from when lab starts. Right, so that's 2:30? Yeah, so it's 2:30, and then at 4:30 you stop drinking water. And then at 6:30 when we're done the lecture, if you've got lab tonight, you need to go to the bathroom, empty your bladder, and leave all that urine in the toilet. Once you've been flushed down the toilet, don't bring it back into the class. And then once you're done with that, come on back in and I'll sort of explain what we're going to do for the rest of the night. Yeah, we did that with questions about that. If you've got lab on Monday, you need to remember the rules, the directions all the way through the weekend. So that on Monday, at 2:30 you stop eating and drinking everything but water. At 4:30 you stop drinking water. All right, so that's that. Last time we talked, we were talking about hearts. We went over the cardiac cycle. I believe we made it to here. I showed you the whole summary table, right? You did all that? Yeah. All right, how do you guys feel about the cardiac cycle? Good. Still works? Still thumping away? Get your blood going? All right. Is it worth me sort of talking through this graph again? Do you guys, are you sick of me talking about it? Both? You're sick of me talking about it, do it again anyways?
Yeah.
Yeah. Fine, all right. So what do we have here? The horizontal axis for all of these graphs represents time. Vertical axis depends on which part of the graph we're looking at. So the bottom, it shows all the electrical activity measured as an ECG. Remember we've got the P wave for atrial depolarization, QRS complex for ventricular depolarization, T wave for ventricular repolarization, then we start all over again with the next P. Next one up, this represents sound. Right, so we get two sounds. The first sound is due to what? Closing the AV valves. And the second sound is due to? Closing the semilunar valves. Nice job. This next graph up here represents the volume of the ventricles. So let's go ahead and walk through this. Let's go back to our little phases. Remember the first phase is late diastole. So this is after the previous contraction has occurred. We're filling up, getting ready for the next contraction. So the ventricles are filling up during late diastole. Atria also are filling up at this time. At this point here where we get this change in the graph, that represents the beginning of atrial systole, which happens to line up with the P wave. So this is when the atria start to contract and they squirt their contents from the atria into the ventricles. We top off the ventricles. Now we enter into the first isovolumetric phase. This is isovolumetric ventricular contraction. The ventricles start to contract. That's correlated with the QRS complex. When they contract, they generate a tremendous force inside. And that force causes the AV valves to shut because the pressure is going to go up. We'll talk about the pressures with that graph a little bit later. The pressures go up, closing the AV valves, but the pressure is not high enough yet for the semilunar valves to open. So during this entire phase, no blood can come in and no blood can go out. All of the valves are shut. This next change in the graph represents the beginning of ventricular ejection. This is when blood squirts out of the ventricles. So the semilunar valves open at this point. Blood leaves the ventricles, causing the volume of the ventricles to decrease. Am I talking too fast?
Yeah.
There's a lot of no's and one yeah. So let's slow down just a teeny bit. We'll try to. All right, so the ventricles are losing volume because the blood's leaving, going into the arteries, the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. At the bottom here, we get another change. So the ventricles are starting to relax. The pressure goes below the pressure of the arteries. The semilunar valves close. So no more blood can leave the ventricles. And, but the ventricular pressure is still higher than the atrial pressure, so the AV valves are not open yet. That leads us to that next isovolumetric phase. Right? Isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. So the ventricles are relaxing now. pressure's decreasing, and once the pressure gets below, the ventricular pressure gets below the atrial pressure, the AV valves open, we get another change. Now we go into late diastole. Blood's pouring into the atria, some of that pours through to the ventricles fill back up again. We start over. Okay? Alright, so if we were to concentrate more on the pressures, we just sort of mentioned that as we went through, you can see during late diastole, the lowest pressure is in the ventricles. Right? That's what's receiving all the blood. Blood's going from the veins to the atria into the ventricles. So the pressure in the ventricles is lower than the pressure in the atria. Not by much, but lower. And that's what allows the AV valves to stay open, blood to pour through. And both of these are much lower than the pressure in the aorta. Remember that this whole set of graphs represents the left side of the heart. Same thing happens in the right side, just at lower pressures. Alright, once the atria contract, the pressure in the atria goes up from the atria squeezing down on its contents. The ventricular pressure goes up because the atrial blood squirts into the ventricles, topping them off, stretching those ventricles a little bit more. You can see that the pressure in the aorta continues to drop because it's between ventricular beats. And so it's losing its pressure slightly as it goes through that cardiac cycle. Then the ventricles contract. The pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the atria, closing the AV valves. That ventricular pressure shoots up. The entire time it's shooting up, it's still lower than the pressure in the aorta, so the semilunar valves are closed until that green line passes the blue line. At that point, the ventricular pressure is higher than the aortic pressure. Semilunar valves open. And once they open, all the blood, not all the blood, a lot of the blood in the ventricles leaves the ventricles and squirts into those arteries, in this case the aorta. And that causes a big surge in pressure in the aorta. So you see the pressure go up. The ventricles finish their contracting, they start to relax, the pressure drops, and eventually drops below the pressure of the aorta, causing us to leave ventricular ejection, going into isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. So the ventricular pressure went below the aortic pressure, causing the semilunar valves to close, but the pressure is still higher than the pressure in the atria, so the AV valves are still shut. So all valves are closed during this isovolumetric phase. And once the pressure gets below the pressure of the atria, the AV valves open, blood pours through from the atria into the ventricles, and we fill back up again. And as we went through all that, we talked about the valves. So during late diastole and during atrial systole, the AV valves are open, semilunar valves are closed. During isovolumetric ventricular contraction, all valves are shut. During ventricular ejection, the semilunar valves are open, that's how blood leaves the ventricles, but the AV valves are closed, no blood comes in. The next isovolumetric phase, all the valves are shut. That's true with all the isovolumetric phases. And then we're back to late diastole, where the semilunar valves are closed, AV valves are open. Yes?
I'm curious about why is the aortic pressure on there and not the pulmonary?
The pulmonary trunk?
Yeah.
Well, the right atrium and the right ventricle pressures are not on there also. So the idea is to kind of simplify it. We could do this whole setup with the right side of the heart, but these pressures just wouldn't be quite as high, but all the trends would be exactly the same and the timing would be the same. So it's to look at just half the heart. There are higher pressures, so it's a little more exaggerated. And you just sort of, you're supposed to carry that over to the right side of the heart. Of course, you don't know what the values of those pressures are, just know that they're less. You don't like that answer? No. Okay. Kind of look like. All right, anything else? Yes?
Would you possibly be willing to record just what you just did and post it online?
Did anyone record that? So you could talk to them about it.
Cool.
I don't think I don't have that recorded. You guys have that in a way that could be shared or no?
I do, but it's just auditorially, I don't know, video.
I have a video.
Yeah.
You have the video also. Oh, was in that video?
Not really, it's not supposed to be online.
Or was that you had to sign a waiver or something? So is that the video such that it could be shared with those that are interested?
I could put it on Google Drive.
Okay. after. It's already been done. You're really close.
Yeah.
You're just gonna get this whole conversation on
What else should I say? Or not say? Okay, anything else? No. All right, because you guys don't want to be in our video. All right, so questions about the cardiac cycle? We got that. Went over this figure a couple times. How does everybody feel about this one? Kind of weird how we go counterclockwise on it, but we'll come back up again in a minute. Don't worry, we're not done with it. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is cardiac output. Cardiac output. So what is cardiac output? Cardiac output is the volume of blood that's pumped out of the heart per unit of time. So it's a volume per time. And when cardiac output is expressed, it's usually expressed as the volume per time leaving the left ventricle. All right, so we're not going to look at both ventricles at the same time. Again, whatever happens on the left side, same as the right side. So we'll just follow one half of the heart. Let's go with the left, because we've been working with the left so far. Okay. It's a rate that blood flows out of the heart. We can express this in the units of liters per minute. Liters per minute, right? So that's volume per time. All right, so now to get a sense for how we control cardiac output, let's think about how to calculate cardiac output. So I'm not going to what do I have you use on this quickly? Yeah, you should know the relationships that we're going to that I'm about to present here that you would use to calculate cardiac output. So you should be able to sort of plug in numbers and work with units. If I ask you to do that on a test, though, it would not be real complicated math. And really the idea behind it is so that you make sure you understand the relationships of the things that go into cardiac output. That's really the reason I want to bring this up, is so you guys see what your body sort of has to work with to adjust cardiac output, what contributes to cardiac output. Okay? All right, so one factor is the heart rate in beats per minute. So how many times your heart contracts in a minute. This is going to contribute to your cardiac output, which would make sense, right? If you were to, your heart rate started to increase, you're beating faster, you'd expect more blood to be squirting out per unit time. Right? It would increase your cardiac output. And then another part of all this would be stroke volume. Stroke volume is in liters per beat. So for each beat, how much blood gets squirted out? All right, so you contract down once, how much just squirt into the aorta, for instance? That would be your stroke volume. So if you know these two, then you can figure out what your cardiac output is. Let's look a little bit closer at stroke volume, though, just to make sure everyone's comfortable with this is. You can think of stroke volume as, have we talked about these? Yeah. And diastolic volume. Did I bring that up before? Great, now is the perfect time. All right, end diastolic volume is EDV. All right, so end diastolic volume. What does diastolic mean? Relaxation, right? The time that you're relaxed. So this is the volume of the ventricles at the end of relaxing. So this is when you're done squirting blood out and you haven't, you've been filling up and you haven't started to contract again yet. So you're ready to contract, you're ready to squirt more blood out, but you haven't done it yet. So your, in this case, the ventricles is as full as they will be. Right? They've filled up, but they haven't started emptying yet. Does that make sense? In diastolic volume? Just think about at the end of atrial systole, right? We just topped off the ventricles. All right, and then ESV, you can probably guess what that is. And systolic volume, systolic refers to contraction. So this is the volume of the ventricles at the end of contracting. Okay, so this is right at the end of ventricular ejection, right when those semilunar valves are about to close. That's the lowest volume in the ventricles during the cardiac cycle. Once you're done ejecting blood, EDV, end diastolic volume, is the largest volume in the ventricles during the cardiac cycle. That's when you're done filling and you're about ready to eject blood. Let's go back to this figure. So we have those marked on here, right? Here's end diastolic volume, here's end systolic volume. Remember with this graph that the horizontal axis represents the volume of the left ventricle. The vertical axis represents the pressure in the left ventricle. So let's just pay attention to the volume now. End diastolic volume. The volume at the end of filling up. Notice that this is to the right as far as we go in this graph. It's the largest volume. This is when you're done filling up and you're about ready to eject blood, but you haven't started ejecting yet. So end diastolic volume is the greatest volume you get in the ventricle during the cardiac cycle. End systolic volume. This is the lowest volume you get in the ventricles during the cardiac cycle. So you've just finished squirting blood out of the ventricles. The semilunar valve closes here. AV valve has not opened yet, and so this is the lowest volume that you get in the ventricle, end systolic volume. Also notice it doesn't go down to zero. When your heart is done squirting blood out for a cardiac cycle, there's still blood left in your heart. It doesn't completely empty. Just like your lungs, when you exhale all the way, get your vital capacity out, there's still air in those lungs. How does everybody feel about end diastolic volume versus end systolic volume? Okay. Pretty good. All right. Okay, so if we abbreviated cardiac output as CO, not carbon monoxide, we could say it equals heart rate times stroke volume. So let's put numbers to it with the units just so we can see how it works out. Let's say we have a heart rate of 72 beats per minute. It's kind of sort of a normal resting heart rate. And let's have a stroke volume of 0.07 liters per beat. So when your heart squirts out blood, it's pointing out about 0.07 liters. Okay. All right, we work through that and it comes out to a convenient 5 liters per minute. So a typical resting cardiac output for an adult healthy male, right, would be about 5 liters per minute. How much blood does an adult healthy male typically have in his body?
Like
9 or 10 pints. You gonna make me convert that?
About 5 liters.
About 5 liters? Any other ideas? No ideas? You guys don't have any thoughts? You're just writing stuff down? You're not even doing that now, you're gonna wait for the Google Drive link, right? So yeah, it's about 5 liters. So typically when you're at rest, your whole blood volume cycles through in about a minute. It's pretty impressive. Right? So there's a fair amount of fluid in your body, right? 5 liters. So that's it's close to 1.5 gallons, I guess, you think, right? So imagine like, you know, a 1 gallon and a half gallon cartons of milk, right? That would be pretty tough to try and drink all that once they don't do it. It's too much, right? That's a lot of fluid though. And you have little muscle that's sitting there in the middle of your thoracic cavity working away. That's pushing that volume per minute throughout your body. And that's just when you're at rest. When you're working hard, that goes up by a lot. Pretty impressive, right? Wow, my body's cool. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to see how are we going to modify cardiac output, right? We need to be able to decrease it, increase it, depending on our body's needs. And so the way we're going to do that is by changing our heart rate and our stroke volume. So now let's go ahead and look at each of these individually to see how our body can change the heart rate and change the stroke volume. Heart rate control. You already know this. We covered this, but we're going to go over it again just as a very quick review. So it could be through sympathetic stimulation. using the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So that's from neurons that innervate the heart. Cause your heart rate to speed up, along with epinephrine, the hormone that was released from your adrenal glands. Remember, this makes those pacemaker cells leakier. So ions causing them to depolarize faster, to reach threshold sooner, get an action potential sooner, you get the next heartbeat sooner. It speeds up your heart rate. And then we could also influence our heart rate through parasympathetic stimulation. And this would be through the release of acetylcholine from neurons, has the opposite effect. It slows down your heart rate. Okay, it takes longer to get to threshold, slows it down. Okay? Everybody got this down? Yeah, okay. Okay? Alright. So we showed you this figure before also. The one on the left shows you the response to sympathetic stimulation. So the gray represents sort of the normal heart rate. The red one represents with sympathetic stimulation, so it speeds up the heart rate. You can see the slope is steeper, you reach threshold sooner, you get a heartbeat sooner. With parasympathetic stimulation, it slows it down, right? We've got this lower slope leading up to threshold. It takes longer until you get to the next beat. All right, so that's heart rate. Let's talk about stroke volume now. How do we change stroke volume? Remember, this is the volume of blood that gets squirted out for each beat. Well, one contributing factor would be the contraction force. How hard the ventricle contracts and squeezes down, that's going to influence the amount of blood that squirts out for that beat. So, if you decrease end systolic volume, remember that's the volume when you're done contracting. Right? So if that volume is lower, that means there's less blood left in your heart, which means it contracted down harder to squirt out that extra blood. So if your end diastolic volume is the same, but your end systolic volume goes down, that means you squirted more blood out. There's less blood left in your heart. More came out, that means your stroke volume just went up. Let's look at this figure. So if we decrease end systolic volume, we're going to assume end diastolic volume stays the same. You decrease that volume, that means this line moves to the left. If it moves to the left, sure, there's less blood left in the heart, but the distance between these two is greater now. So if you move this line over to the left, that means that you squirt more blood out. Do see how that works? I'm getting some nods, I'm getting some looks of like, I almost got it. May have a question about that? No. All right. So contraction force is one contributor. Also venous return, which we're going to see is going to relate back to contraction force. Venous return. So the amount of blood that comes back to the heart is also going to influence stroke volume. So venous return is the blood entering the ventricles. Remember, when blood comes back to the heart, it comes through veins. First, then it goes to the atria, and whatever goes in the atria is going to get passed on to the ventricles. So, if you increase end diastolic volume, you fill your ventricles up more, that's going to lead to an increase in stroke volume. So for your stroke volume to go up, you can put more blood in your ventricles, and you can leave less in your ventricles, meaning contract really hard to squirt more of that blood out. Both of those contribute to an increase in stroke volume. Fill it up more and contract down harder. And these two are actually related to each other. Let's see how they are. Everybody have this down? Okay, let's think about the pre-contraction length of the muscle cells. This right away should sound familiar. Does it? No, it doesn't. It does. Okay. Let's walk through this. If you increase venous return, so more blood comes back to the heart, which means your end diastolic volume goes up, you fill your heart more, the muscles are going to stretch more. The cells that make up the wall of the ventricles are going to stretch more. So if you increase that muscle stretch, which means those muscles are longer before you stimulate them, then the force of contraction goes up. They're going to contract harder. And if they contract harder, then they're going to squirt more blood out and leave less in the heart, causing a lower end systolic volume. And all of that leads to a rise in stroke volume. So more blood came back to the heart, it's stretched out, it's filled up more now. It's going to cause the force of contraction to be greater. It's going to squeeze down harder than it normally would, squirting all that extra blood out, plus leaving less blood in the ventricles than it usually does. And all that contributes to more blood getting squirted out, higher stroke volume. Okay. All right. This relationship is called Starling's Law of the Heart. The more blood that comes back to the harder it contracts, the more blood it squirts out. Who is Starling? Maybe it's named after the bird. Probably not. I don't know. Probably a physiologist of some kind. Does anybody know who Starling is? No.
Can you repeat that last line, the more blood that comes back to the heart?
Sure. The more blood that comes back to the heart, the greater the ventricles stretch, the harder they contract, and more blood gets squirted out, stroke volume goes up. I think that was actually pretty different from what I just said.
Yeah.
But it's the same point. Okay, anything else for now? Okay, let's look at this figure. This figure should look familiar, right? Nobody wants to talk about it. What does this figure represent? Sarcomeres, muscles, last exam. So what this has here, this all represents skeletal muscle, not cardiac muscle. Right? We've got the percent of muscle length at the bottom of the horizontal axis, so that's how much the muscle fiber is stretched or squashed before you stimulate it, and then the amount of force you actually get out of contraction once you do stimulate that muscle fiber. Right? It's expressed as a percent of its total maximum. So the highest it can be is 100%. And notice that there's some middle length here that gives you the most amount of tension. Right? So if you stretch it too much, or if you start stretching it and then zap it, you're going to get less force. If you compress it first and stimulate it, you get less force. So there's some intermediate amount, and that's the sweet spot right here in the middle where you get the most amount of contraction. So stretching or compressing before you stimulate gives you a decrease in tension. That's not what's going on in our heart. Right? Because what we just learned is the more blood that comes back, the more it stretches before you stimulate it, the greater the force. So it's almost like instead of going up and then back down, it just keeps going up forever. Everybody see that? But that can't be. Right? You can't put an infinite amount of blood into your ventricles and expect this infinitely high force of contraction. So what does this curve look like for contractile myocardial cells? It looks more like this. Really, it's the same kind of curve we have for skeletal muscle. It's just that cardiac muscle works on the left side. So if you kept stretching those muscles, eventually it would start to come back down. But we never stretch them that much. We only work on the left half of the curve. Right? That's how your heart's set up in your body. So, normal resting stroke volumes and cardiac output, you're maybe at this point of the curve. If you increase your venous return, you're going to stretch those cells a little bit and then stimulate them, you're going to get more force. It's going to contract harder. squirting more blood out. And if you had even more come in, then you'd contract even harder. Okay, so this explains Starling's law of the heart, or why increase in venous return leads to higher contraction force and a larger stroke volume. How does everybody feel about that? Good enough? Okay. They seem especially quiet today. Yes?
Well, it's because I haven't eaten.
Well, only half of you have that excuse. But I appreciate the sacrifices you make for your own education. Yeah, you're welcome.
Can you just, I just did not get a clear, like, one sentence, I guess, with the law of the heart. I'm spacing out. Call space, space.
Yeah, well, thanks for going through with yourself there. All right, so you want one little summary statement that explains what Starling's law of the heart is?
Yes.
Could it be a run-on sentence? So Starling's law of the heart says the greater the venous return, the more the muscle cells stretch, the harder the force of contraction, greater the amount of blood that squirts out, stroke volume goes up.
Say it.
You know, one of those little flow charts I made might be.
Sorry, I got just to the 14th contraction.
Well, just walk through this, right?
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. So if you have an increase in venous return,
Yeah.
which really means a higher end diastolic volume, then the muscles in the wall of your heart stretch more. They contract harder, you have a greater force. That leads to a lower end systolic volume. So there's less blood left in the heart. And all of that together leads to a rise in stroke volume. When stroke volume goes up, then cardiac output goes up. You're welcome. Anything else for now? All right. Okay. So now let's talk about what caused venous return to increase. So in a way, we're kind of working backwards. Okay. How do you get more blood to come back to the heart? Well, one way is through vein compression. So you've got all these veins that are carrying blood back to the heart. If those veins get squashed down, then there's less volume in those veins. Where does that blood go? It's not going to go backwards. It gets pushed or accelerated towards the heart. So it causes a surge of blood to come back to the heart. And this can happen through the skeletal muscle pump. Skeletal muscle pump. How does this work? Well, we have that written down. So here's a drawing of the skeletal muscle. And let's imagine this is our gastrocnemius muscle, so our calf muscle. All right, it's got two heads to it. And so think of these, the two parts to that muscle.